Bone dust smells like burnt hair and pennies. Maggie scraped it from her cuticles with a plastic stirrer, ignoring the screaming from bed 4. 60 minutes, 10 bodies dragged back from the edge. She wanted a cigarette, not a medal. Then heavy combat boots stopped at her station. Fluorescent lights hummed with a sick, erratic buzz. Trauma Bay 1 smelled of raw meat, stale sweat, and the sharp, chemical sting of iodine. It was a Tuesday. Tuesdays were supposed to be quiet, reserved for minor lacerations and drug seekers trying to score die lauded. Instead, a multi-vehicle pileup on the interstate involving a commuter bus and a logging truck had turned the emergency department into a meat grinder. Maggie O'Connor did not run. Running caused panic, and panic got people killed. She walked with a heavy, flat-footed gait, her clogs making a wet, sticky sound against the linoleum. Her scrubs, blue at the start of her shift, were painted in abstract splashes of brown and crimson. She stopped at bed 2. A man, mid-40s, face pulverized into an unrecognizable mass of swelling and fractured bone, was drowning in his own fluids. His chest heaved in jerky, desperate spasms. Beside him, a first-year resident named Daniel Heller stood frozen, a laryngoscope shaking in his pale, gloved hand. He was staring at the wreck of the man's face, paralyzed by the sheer volume of trauma. "Move," Maggie said. It wasn't a request. Her voice was flat, raspy from too much cheap coffee and too little sleep. Heller blinked, snapping out of his stupor. "I can't get an airway. There's too much—" "I said move." Maggie shoved him aside with her hip. She didn't look at the man's face. Looking at faces made them human, and right now, this wasn't a human. It was a broken plumbing system that needed fixing. She grabbed a suction yankower, jamming it into the ruined cavity of the mouth, clearing the pooling fluids with a loud, wet, slurping sound. "Scalpel. 10 blade." Heller fumbled, handing it over. Maggie didn't hesitate. She palpated the neck, finding the cricothyroid membrane through the swelling. She made the incision. It wasn't neat. It wasn't textbook. It was fast. She shoved a Shiley tube into the hole, connected the bag, and squeezed. The man's chest rose. "Bag him," she ordered, shoving the resuscitator into Heller's chest. "Do not stop until I tell you." She pivoted. Bed 3 was a screaming teenager with a jagged piece of fiberglass jutting from his thigh. Bed 4 was a silent woman in her 60s, pale as parchment, her blood pressure bottoming out. Silent was worse than screaming. Screaming meant airway, breathing, and circulation were at least partially intact. Maggie stepped over a discarded bloody towel, slipping slightly on a slick patch of iodine. Her lower back throbbed, a dull, familiar ache that she usually drowned in ibuprofen. She ignored it. For the next 50 minutes, she ceased to be a 34-year-old woman with a failing marriage and a mountain of student debt. She became a machine. She started 2 large-bore IVs in a morbidly obese truck driver whose veins were hidden beneath inches of adipose tissue, doing it entirely by feel. The pop of the needle breaching the vein, the dark flash in the chamber. It was purely tactile. When the pharmacy delayed sending up the O negative, she marched to the blood bank herself, kicking the swinging doors open and intimidating the tech into handing over 6 units without the proper requisition forms. At the 30-minute mark, a woman in bed 6 coded. Ventricular fibrillation. Maggie slapped the pads onto the woman's sweaty, clammy chest. The smell of burning hair filled the bay as she hit the shock button. The body seized, arching off the gurney before slamming back down. Maggie climbed onto a stool, locking her elbows, and began compressions. The sickening crunch of ribs cracking under her palms vibrated up her forearms. It was a brutal, violent rhythm. She hated the feeling, the way the cartilage gave way like dry twigs. But 2 minutes later, the monitor beeped with a sluggish, irregular rhythm. A pulse. She stepped down, gasping, sweat pooling in the small of her back and trickling down her spine. The latex of her gloves snapped tight, a small tear appearing at the thumb. She ripped them off, the powder leaving her hands feeling dry and chalky, and grabbed a fresh pair. 10 patients, 10 critical, teetering on the edge of the abyss. By the time the clock hit the hour mark, the chaotic symphony of the trauma bay began to decrescendo. Surgeons had arrived, hauling the worst cases up to the OR. The lesser injuries were stabilized, packaged, and shipped to the ICU. Maggie stood in the center of the bay. The floor was a disaster zone of discarded wrappers, bloody gauze, and plastic caps. The overwhelming stench of copper and bowel movements hung heavy in the air, overpowering the hospital-grade ventilation. She felt a tremor in her left hand. She clenched it into a fist, staring at her knuckles. She wasn't relieved. She wasn't proud. She was profoundly, violently annoyed. She needed to pee. Her mouth tasted like ash, and she had 4 more hours left on her shift. Silence in an emergency room is never a reward. It is a threat. It means the storm has passed, leaving you alone with the wreckage and the ringing in your ears. Maggie dragged herself to the deep aluminum sink in the corner of the trauma bay. She kicked the foot pedal. The water sputtered, then flowed, lukewarm and smelling faintly of chlorine. She pumped a handful of pink, abrasive chlorhexidine soap onto her palms and began to scrub. The water running off her hands turned a pale, watery red before running clear. She scrubbed harder, the stiff bristles of the brush digging into her cuticles, scraping away the dried flakes of other people's tragedies. "You okay, O'Connor?" It was Heller. The resident was leaning against a supply cart, looking like he had aged 5 years in the last hour. He had a smear of something brown on his forehead, right above his eyebrow. "You have shit on your face, Daniel," Maggie said, not looking up from the sink. Heller scrubbed frantically at his forehead with his sleeve. "I mean it. What you did out there, that crick on the facial trauma, I've never seen anyone move like that. Not even the attending. It's plumbing," Maggie muttered, shutting off the water. She grabbed a rough paper towel, drying her hands until the skin was raw and red. "Pipe is blocked. You make a new pipe. Don't romanticize it. Go chart your notes before risk management crawls up your ass." Heller opened his mouth to argue, perhaps to offer some earnest, naive gratitude. But the pneumatic hiss of the main ER doors interrupted him. Heavy footsteps, not the squeak of rubber-soled nursing shoes or the frantic tapping of a doctor's loafers. These were measured, deliberate strikes of leather and rubber against tile. Maggie tossed the paper towel into the biohazard bin and turned. 3 men walked into the ER. 2 were in standard Navy working uniforms, looking uncomfortable and out of place among the gurneys and AV poles. The man leading them wore service dress blues. The harsh fluorescent lighting caught the gold lace on his sleeves, 1 wide stripe, 2 narrow, a vice admiral. He was tall, his posture rigidly straight, with hair the color of steel wool cropped close to his scalp. His face was weathered, deeply lined around the eyes and mouth, carrying the kind of permanent exhaustion that came from carrying too many secrets. The scent of him arrived before he spoke. Heavy starch, brass polish, and the faint ozone smell of the outside air. It cut through the stench of the trauma bay like a knife. The charge nurse, a perpetually stressed woman named Brenda, intercepted them. "Excuse me, sir, you can't be back here. This is a restricted area. Visiting hours." The Admiral didn't even look at her. He gently but firmly moved past Brenda, as if she were a piece of misplaced furniture. His eyes were scanning the room, bypassing the doctors, ignoring the bloody wreckage on the floor. His gaze locked onto Maggie, Maggie went entirely still. The dull ache in her back vanished, replaced by a sudden icy spike of adrenaline that made the previous hour's rush feel like a child's game. Her breath hitched, catching in the back of her throat. She recognized the walk. She recognized the tilt of the head. Tyler Reed. He stopped 10 feet from her. The 2 aides flanked him, standing at parade rest, their eyes fixed on the wall behind her. The ER had gone dead silent. Even Heller had stopped moving, sensing the abrupt shift in the atmospheric pressure. Reed looked her up and down. He took in the blood-soaked scrubs, the messy bun held together by a plastic syringe casing, the dark, bruised bags under her eyes. He didn't look disgusted. He looked exactly the same as he had 6 years ago on a dusty tarmac in Kandahar. Unreadable. "You look like hell," Reed said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the quiet room. Maggie crossed her arms over her chest, burying her hands in her armpits to hide the sudden tremor returning to her fingers. She didn't salute. She didn't stand at attention. She shifted her weight onto her back leg and tilted her chin up. "It's an emergency room, Admiral," she said, her voice dripping with a caustic cynicism she hadn't used in years. "We don't get much time for touch-ups. What do you want?" Brenda gasped loudly from the nurse's station. Heller looked like he was about to faint. "You didn't speak to a 2-star admiral like he was a vagrant asking for change." Reed ignored the audience. He took a step closer, invading her space. The smell of starch was overwhelming now. 10 criticals, 60 minutes. The paramedics said it was a slaughterhouse. They also said one nurse kept the entire circus from burning down. "It's my job," Maggie snapped. "I get paid $32 an hour to keep people from dying on the floor. Now, unless you have a laceration that needs suturing or a chest pain complaint, you're violating HIPAA just by breathing in here." A ghost of a smile tugged at the corner of Reed's mouth. It wasn't a friendly expression. "Still biting the heads off anyone who gets too close." He paused, letting the silence stretch out, twisting the knife. "Been a long time, Wraith." The call sign hit her like a physical blow. Wraith. She hadn't heard that name since she packed away her desert camos and swore she would never touch another combat trauma kit again. It felt dirty hearing it here, under the sterile, humming lights of a civilian hospital in Chicago. It belonged to the dirt, the screaming, and the rotary wash of medevac choppers. "Maggie," she corrected, her voice dropping an octave, losing its sarcastic edge and becoming something hard and dangerous. "My name is Maggie. Wraith is dead. She died when I handed over my papers." Reed's expression hardened, the amusement vanishing. "She's not dead. She just traded sand for linoleum." He reached into the inner pocket of his dress coat and pulled out a manila envelope, sealed with red wax. He didn't hand it to her. He held it suspended between them. "I wouldn't be here if she was dead. We need you back." Maggie stared at the envelope. It looked heavy. It looked like a death sentence. She uncrossed her arms, her blood-stained hands hanging uselessly at her sides. The scent of iron and raw meat seemed to surge back into her nose, suffocating her. "No," Maggie said, turning her back on him and walking toward the supply closet. "Get out of my ER." Cardboard dust coated the metal shelving of the supply closet, mixing with the sharp, synthetic odor of sterile plastic packaging and expired saline. Maggie shoved the heavy fire door shut, the latch catching with a solid, echoing click. She leaned back against the cool fiberglass of the door, sliding down until her ruined knees hit the linoleum with a heavy thud. She dug the heels of her hands into her eye sockets until bursts of static white light exploded behind her eyelids. Her breathing was uneven, ragged at the edges. Adrenaline is a finite resource. When it leaves the body, it doesn't fade gracefully. It drops you off a cliff. Her lower back screamed. She reached into her scrub pocket, her fingers bypassing a bloody pen light and a crumpled roll of medical tape, finding a loose, lint-covered ibuprofen tablet. She tossed it back, swallowing it dry. It scraped down her esophagus, tasting bitter and chalky. The heavy metal door handle rattled, turned, and shoved inward. Maggie barely managed to shift her weight before the door swung open, forcing her to scramble to her feet. Admiral Tyler Reed stood in the doorway, blocking the harsh glare of the hallway fluorescents. Up close, the pristine nature of his uniform felt offensive. There wasn't a speck of lint, not a single thread out of place, while Maggie smelled like gastric acid and iron. "You can't hide in the linen closet, O'Connor," Reed said, stepping inside and letting the door click shut behind him. The closet was barely large enough for a rolling cart of IV bags. With his broad shoulders, the space felt suffocating. "It's a central supply closet," Maggie corrected, her voice low and hostile. She didn't move away from him. She held her ground between a rack of intubation kits and a stack of bedpans. "And I'm not hiding. I'm taking my mandated 15-minute break. State law." Reed glanced at the racks, his eyes sweeping over the boxes of Kerlix gauze and Tegaderm patches as if evaluating a poorly stocked armory. "You were always good at compartmentalizing, shoving the mess into a neat little box and slamming the lid. Looks like you've made a career out of it." "My career is saving lives, Admiral. Actual lives. Not sending 19-year-old kids into the dirt so you can move a pin on a satellite map. We don't use pins anymore." He held out the manila envelope again. The thick red wax seal caught the dim overhead light. "Take the file, Maggie. I am a civilian." She crossed her arms, digging her fingers into the stiff, dried patches of fluid on her sleeves. "I have a mortgage. I have $60,000 in nursing school debt. I have an ex-husband who calls me twice a week to complain about my dog. I don't jump out of helicopters anymore. I don't pack bullet wounds in the dark. I fix car crashes and heart attacks." Reed didn't blink. He simply placed the envelope on a cardboard box of large-bore syringes between them. 3 days ago, a joint task force went dark in the Sahel. A recon team. 5 men. Maggie stared at the wall over his shoulder. "Not my problem. They were compromised. Ambushed." Riord's voice lost its brassy, authoritative edge, settling into a grim, mechanical cadence. "They managed to break contact and hole up in a cave system, but they are chewed to pieces. 2 critical, 3 stable but immobile. The region is hot. Anti-air batteries blanket the sector. We can't get a dust-off chopper within 50 miles. Maggie squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to hear the logistics. The logistics always ended in bodies. "So send a ground mobility force." "We are, but they have to cross hostile terrain. It will take them 48 hours to reach the coordinates." Reed leaned in, and the smell of starch gave way to the faint, sour scent of stale coffee on his breath. "The medics we sent in with the QRF are green. They know how to slap on a tourniquet and push morphine. They don't know how to keep a man with a shredded pelvis and a collapsed lung alive for 2 days in a cave with 0 sterile equipment." "And you think I can?" "I know you can." Reed's eyes locked onto hers, dark and unrelenting. "Kandahar, 2018. You kept 3 Rangers alive in a bombed-out cellar for 30 hours using duct tape, a pocket knife, and half a liter of saline. One of them died on the table at Bagram." Maggie shot back, her voice cracking. The memory tasted like ash in the back of her throat, the slick, impossible volume of blood pooling on the concrete floor, the sound of her own voice going hoarse from screaming for a medevac that wasn't coming. "You forget that part of the after-action report, Tom. 2 lived. Nobody else could have kept them breathing past the first hour." Reed tapped the thick envelope. "There's a C-17 idling on the tarmac at O'Hare. Wheels up in 3 hours. We have a sterile mobile trauma pod ready to drop with the QRF. But it's useless without someone who knows how to operate in the gray zone between life and death. The team leader is Captain Jackson Miller. Maggie's breath hitched. A sharp, physical pain lanced through her chest, completely unrelated to her tired muscles. Jackson, the loud-mouthed kid from Texas who used to steal her protein bars. She looked down at the envelope. It seemed to vibrate on top of the cardboard box. "You played dirty," Maggie whispered, her voice stripped of all its armor. "I play to win," Reed replied flatly. "Which means bringing my people home. You're the best trauma stabilizer I've ever seen. I need the Wraith. Don't call me that." Maggie reached out. Her hand was trembling. The fine motor skills that had just perfectly executed an emergency cricothyroidotomy were suddenly useless. Her fingers brushed the rough manila paper. It felt like sandpaper. She picked it up. Reed stepped back, restoring the oxygen to the tiny room. "There's a black Suburban outside the ambulance bay. You have 45 minutes to clear your locker." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and walked out, the heavy fire door swinging shut behind him on pneumatic hinges, sealing Maggie back in the quiet, sterile-smelling dark. Locker room benches always smell like athlete's foot and despair. Maggie sat on the scarred wooden slat, staring at the grey metal of locker 42. The emergency room on the other side of the cinderblock wall was finally quiet, the chaotic energy completely burnt out, leaving behind a hollow, ringing silence. She peeled off her scrub top. It stuck to the sweat on her back, making a wet, peeling sound. She dropped it directly into the biohazard bin, not caring that she'd be charged for the lost uniform. Her undershirt was soaked through, sticking to her ribs. She stripped it off, shivering as the aggressive hospital air conditioning hit her damp skin. In the mirror above the sinks, she looked like a corpse that had been rudely awakened. Dark, bruised hollows sank beneath her eyes. Her skin was a pallid, unhealthy grey. She turned on the tap, waiting for the water to warm, then splashed it over her face. It smelled faintly of copper. Or maybe that was just permanently etched into her olfactory receptors now. She opened the manila envelope. There were no flowery letters of reinstatement, no patriotic speeches typed on letterhead, just raw data. Satellite topography maps of a desolate ridgeline in the Sahel. Medical briefs patched together from broken radio transmissions. Patient 1, GSW to upper left quadrant. Suspected bowel perforation, tachycardic. Patient 2, shrapnel to lower extremities. Bilateral amputations required. Tourniquets applied 14 hours ago. Maggie ran a thumb over the printed text. Bilateral amputations. 14 hours. The tissue would be completely necrotic. The toxins building up behind those tourniquets would hit his heart the second they were loosened, killing him instantly. It was a butcher's job. It wasn't healing. It was brutal, mechanical damage control. She dropped the files into her duffel bag, tossing her civilian clothes on top of them. Jeans that were a little too tight. A faded grey hoodie with a frayed zipper. She dressed mechanically, the rough denim scraping against her tired legs. She didn't shower. The dirt and sweat felt like armor. Washing it off would mean becoming vulnerable, and right now she needed the armor. Daniel Heller was standing at the nurse's station when she walked out, a lukewarm cup of coffee in his hand. He looked up, his eyes immediately dropping to her heavy duffel bag. "O'Connor," he said, stepping into her path. "You're off? Shift isn't over for another hour." "Taking personal time," Maggie said, her voice flat. She didn't stop walking, forcing Heller to pivot and match her stride down the corridor. "Wait." Heller reached out, his hand hovering near her elbow, but not quite touching her. I wanted to say thank you. For earlier, in Bay 2. I froze. You didn't." Maggie stopped at the double doors leading to the ambulance bay. She looked at the young resident. He was soft. His scrubs were clean except for the small brown smear he had finally washed off his forehead. He had no idea what it meant to have blood permanently embedded under his fingernails. "You froze because you looked at his face, Daniel," Maggie said. Her tone wasn't unkind, just devastatingly factual. "You saw a man with a life and a family and a favorite sports team. Stop doing that. They aren't people. They are broken machines. Fix the machine. The person comes back later." She pushed through the doors before he could respond. The humidity of the Chicago night hit her like a wet towel. The air smelled of exhaust fumes, damp concrete, and the distant metallic scent of an approaching thunderstorm. The ambulance bay was empty of rigs, the concrete stained with oil spots and water puddles from a recent hose down. A black Chevrolet Suburban sat idling at the curb. Its engine gave off a low, thrumming vibration that Maggie could feel in the soles of her worn-out sneakers. The tinted windows were opaque, reflecting the yellow sodium lights of the parking garage. As she approached, the back door popped open. Admiral Reed was sitting in the gloom, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of a tablet in his lap. Maggie stopped at the open door. She didn't get in. She dropped her duffel bag onto the wet concrete. It landed with a heavy, final thud. "My student loans," Maggie said, staring into the dark interior. Reed didn't look up from his tablet. "Gone. The VA will process a retroactive combat hazard bonus. It'll clear by Monday. And my dog, Buster. He's a golden retriever mix. He has a sensitive stomach. My aide is already at your apartment with a bag of grain-free kibble. He'll be boarded at a premier facility in the suburbs until you return." Maggie gripped the door frame. The metal was cool and damp. She looked back over her shoulder at the glowing red emergency sign over the hospital doors. It looked small, insignificant against the sprawling, messy dark of the city. She had spent 6 years trying to outrun the ghost of the desert, burying herself in the sterile, predictable routine of civilian trauma. But you can't outrun a ghost when the ghost is just a reflection in the mirror. "If Miller dies because your pilots take too long to cross that airspace," Maggie said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, jagged ice. "I'm going to break your nose, Tom." Reed finally looked up, the harsh blue light carving deep shadows into the lines of his face. He offered no reassurances, no military platitudes. He just nodded once. "Understood. Get in, Wraith." Maggie picked up her bag, tossing it onto the floorboards. She climbed into the heavy, leather-scented darkness of the SUV, pulling the door shut behind her. The lock engaged with a loud, definitive clack. The engine roared, the tires gripping the wet concrete as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, leaving the hospital and the safety of the civilian world in the rearview mirror. If you felt the adrenaline, the grit, and the raw truth in Maggie's story, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to support deeply human storytelling, share this video with someone who loves intense, grounded drama, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. We have plenty more heart-pounding, realistic stories coming your way every single week. Ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Let me know your thoughts on Maggie's choice in the comments below.